Thomas Parker never imagined that the most painful decision of his life would happen outside an intensive care unit. The envelope in his hand felt heavier than paper ever should. Inside were divorce papers bearing both his name and his wife's. He had read every page twice before leaving home that morning, convincing himself there was no other choice. Weeks of unanswered questions, sleepless nights, growing debt, whispered phone calls, and a wife who seemed to be drifting farther away had led him here. Across the hallway, Tiffany Carter sat alone beneath a television that nobody seemed to be watching. Her shoulders slumped against the cold wall as she stared at the floor without really seeing it. Her neatly tied hair had begun to loosen, dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and the paper coffee cup beside her had long gone cold. She hadn't moved in nearly 20 minutes. Neither of them noticed the families passing through the corridor. Some prayed quietly. Others waited for good news that refused to come quickly enough. Thomas stopped several feet away. For a brief moment, he wondered whether he should simply turn around and leave. His fingers tightened around the envelope. He remembered every unanswered text. Every late night, Tiffany claimed she was working. Every conversation that ended with, "I'll explain later." Later never came. He had spent months believing his marriage was slipping away one secret at a time. Now he was convinced there was nothing left to save. Without saying a word, he walked toward her. Tiffany slowly lifted her head. The exhaustion in her eyes wasn't anger. It wasn't guilt. It looked more like someone who had been carrying the weight of an entire family for far too long. Thomas didn't notice. He was too hurt to look beyond his own heartbreak. He extended the envelope. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tiffany looked down at the papers, confused at first. When she realized what they were, every bit of color disappeared from her face. She searched Thomas's eyes, hoping to find some sign that this was only frustration speaking. Instead, she found a man who believed he'd already lost his wife long before he arrived at the hospital. Just a few steps away, behind the ICU doors, doctors were fighting to save the life of Thomas's 64-year-old mother, Paige Parker. Neither husband nor wife realized that before the day was over, one truth would change everything they believed about each other. But to understand how a marriage reached this heartbreaking moment, we have to go back several months. Before hospital corridors, before legal documents, and before silence became louder than love. Welcome to Hollow Creek Chronicles, a place where every quiet town has a hidden story, every stranger has a past, and every choice leaves a lasting mark. If this is your first visit, we're happy you found us. If you've been here before, welcome back. Subscribe and join us as we uncover stories that remind us what it truly means to be human. Several months earlier, life moved at a gentler pace in a quiet neighborhood on the northern side of Tampa, Florida. Morning sunlight filtered through rows of oak trees draped with Spanish moss, while neighbors walked their dogs before heading off to work. Lawn sprinklers clicked rhythmically across neatly trimmed yards, and the familiar scent of fresh coffee drifted from open kitchen windows. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved to one another without expecting a conversation, and where familiar faces had become part of daily life. Thomas Parker had already been awake for over an hour. At 38, he owned a small HVAC business that had taken years to build. Success hadn't come easily. Every customer, every repair call, and every recommendation had been earned through long days spent climbing attics in Florida's relentless heat. Dependability had become part of who he was. His tools were always organized. His truck was always clean. His promises were always kept. Friends often described him as the person who could fix almost anything. Almost. Inside the kitchen, Tiffany Carter carefully packed 2 lunches while checking the time on her phone. At 30 years old, she worked as a revenue cycle specialist at one of Tampa's largest hospitals. Most people outside healthcare barely understood what that title meant, but Tiffany knew every insurance code, billing procedure, payment adjustment, and financial assistance policy almost by heart. She believed no family should lose sleep simply because they didn't understand complicated paperwork. Her work demanded patience. Her heart demanded even more. Despite the early hour, she greeted Thomas with the same warm smile she had worn since their college days. "Don't forget you promised your mom dinner tonight," she reminded him while placing his lunch bag beside his keys. Thomas laughed softly, as if she'd ever let me forget. Their easy conversation carried the comfort that only years together could create. There were no raised voices, no cold silences, no reason to believe anything was wrong. Just a husband and wife beginning another ordinary day. A few miles away, Paige Parker stood in her cozy kitchen, humming an old gospel hymn while carefully watering the flowers outside her back window. Retirement suited her. After decades working as a school librarian, she had settled into a peaceful routine filled with church activities, neighborhood book clubs, gardening, and weekly family dinners. She treasured those dinners more than anything else. Whenever Thomas and Tiffany visited, she insisted on cooking far more food than 3 people could ever finish. She claimed leftovers always tasted better the next day. Thomas claimed she simply enjoyed feeding people. Both were probably true. That evening, the familiar smell of homemade pot roast filled Paige's dining room. The 3 of them laughed over stories from work. Thomas joked about a customer who insisted his air conditioner was haunted because it made strange noises every night. Tiffany smiled so hard that tears formed in her eyes. Paige laughed loud enough to shake the dining room windows. For a little while, life felt wonderfully ordinary. None of them knew that ordinary moments often become the ones people miss the most. As dinner ended, Paige quietly rubbed the side of her abdomen before quickly lowering her hand. Neither Thomas nor Tiffany noticed. The conversation continued. The laughter remained. Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. Inside that warm little home, a family enjoyed what felt like another ordinary night together. They had no idea they were sharing one of the last evenings before everything they believed about love, sacrifice, trust, and family would be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. The weeks that followed settled into a familiar rhythm. Thomas left home before sunrise most mornings, answering service calls across Tampa and the surrounding neighborhoods. Business had been steady enough to keep food on the table, though rising costs meant every dollar had a purpose before it even reached the bank account. Tiffany's schedule had become just as demanding. Her days were spent helping patients and families understand hospital bills that often felt impossible to decode. She explained deductibles, corrected insurance errors, located payment options, and connected frightened people with financial assistance programs they never knew existed. She had always believed that knowledge could ease fear. She never imagined she would soon need that knowledge for someone she loved. Every Thursday evening belonged to Paige. No matter how busy life became, Thomas and Tiffany made time to visit his mother. Sometimes they brought groceries. Sometimes they helped with small repairs around the house. Other evenings they simply sat together, talking for hours over coffee and homemade dessert. Those visits became the highlight of Paige's week. At first, the changes were easy to dismiss. Paige seemed a little more tired than usual. She occasionally paused halfway through a sentence, pressing a hand lightly against her stomach before forcing another smile. "If getting older had a personality," she joked one evening, "I'd like to have a serious conversation with it." Thomas chuckled. "You've been saying that since you turned 50. And I was right then, too." The laughter eased everyone's mind. No one believed there was any real reason to worry. Over the following month, however, those little moments became harder to ignore. Paige canceled her weekly church volunteer shift because she said she wasn't feeling up to it. She skipped her neighborhood book club for the first time in years. Even tending to her flowers seemed to leave her unusually tired. One Saturday morning, Tiffany glanced across the living room and noticed Paige slowly lowering herself into a chair, wincing before disguising the discomfort with another smile. "You okay?" Tiffany asked gently. "Oh, sweetheart. Probably just something I ate." "You've been saying that a lot lately." "I'm 64. Paige replied with a playful shrug. At my age, everything has an excuse. Tiffany smiled politely, but concern settled quietly in the back of her mind. A few days later, Paige agreed to visit her primary care physician. The appointment seemed routine. The doctor recommended additional testing after hearing about the persistent abdominal discomfort. It could be several things, the physician explained calmly. I'd rather rule out anything serious. Paige nodded. Thomas looked relieved. Tiffany noticed the doctor's careful choice of words. Over the next several weeks, one appointment turned into several. Blood work, ultrasounds, follow-up consultations, additional imaging. Every visit seemed to produce another recommendation instead of an answer. The uncertainty became exhausting. One afternoon, Tiffany offered to drive Paige home after another appointment. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as traffic crawled through downtown Tampa. Neither woman spoke for several minutes. Finally, Paige broke the silence. I hate feeling like a burden. Tiffany looked over briefly. You've never been a burden. I know Thomas worries. He loves you. I know. Paige hesitated before speaking again. I don't want him carrying any more than he already does. Tiffany reached across the center console and gently squeezed her hand. We'll figure this out. Paige smiled faintly. I hope so. The medical letters started arriving not long afterward. Some contained appointment confirmations. Others explained laboratory charges. Several included insurance processing notices. Tiffany happened to collect the mail one evening while Thomas was still outside unloading equipment from his truck. She casually sorted through the envelopes. One letter immediately caught her attention. It wasn't the hospital logo that concerned her. It was the words printed near the top. Coverage verification required. Her heartbeat quickened. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Tiffany sat alone at the kitchen table reading every page twice. The notice referenced missing enrollment documentation. Certain claims had not processed correctly. Without updated information, future coverage could be affected. She frowned. Something wasn't right. The following afternoon, Tiffany stopped by Paige's house after work. She placed the letter carefully on the kitchen table. Can we talk about this? Paige looked at the envelope. Her expression changed instantly. She lowered herself into a chair without saying a word. You've seen this before, Tiffany said quietly. Paige nodded. I didn't know how to tell anyone. What happened? Paige stared at her folded hands. I received paperwork months ago. She swallowed hard. I thought I had more time. You didn't send it back? I filled out part of it. Her voice became almost inaudible. Then I set it aside. I meant to finish it the next morning. She shook her head slowly. I forgot. The room fell silent. Finally, Paige whispered the words she had been carrying alone. I missed the deadline. Tiffany closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not because she was angry, because she immediately understood how serious that mistake could become. Paige looked ready to cry. I never wanted Thomas to know. You were scared. I felt embarrassed. You don't have to explain. I've always handled my own affairs. Paige's voice trembled. I can't believe I made such a foolish mistake. Tiffany walked around the table and knelt beside her. She gently took Paige's hands. We're not going to panic, but we're going to deal with it. I don't even know where to begin. I do. Paige searched Tiffany's face. You do? Tiffany nodded with quiet confidence. I work with situations like this every day. You shouldn't have to fix my mistakes. I'm not fixing them because I have to. She smiled warmly. I'm doing it because we're family. Tears filled Paige's eyes. You really think there's hope? There always is. Paige let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Please. She hesitated. Don't tell Thomas yet. Tiffany remained silent for a moment. She understood why Paige was asking. Thomas had enough pressure keeping his business running. Adding another financial crisis would only weigh him down further. "I'll handle it," Tiffany finally said. "You promise?" "I promise." That single promise would quietly reshape all three of their lives. Over the next week, Thomas noticed subtle changes in his wife. She seemed distracted during dinner. She checked emails more often. Sometimes she stared at her phone without responding when he spoke. Late one evening, he watched her close her laptop the moment he entered the living room. "What are you working on?" "Just something from the office." "You've been bringing work home a lot lately." "It'll settle down." "You've said that for weeks." "I'm fine." Thomas wasn't convinced. One Friday evening, he opened the household budgeting app on his phone while paying monthly bills. He frowned. "Tiff?" She looked up from the sink. "Yeah?" "Did something come out of savings?" She froze for the briefest moment. "What do you mean?" "There are a few withdrawals I don't recognize. They're work-related." "Work-related?" "I'll explain later." Thomas leaned against the kitchen counter. "You keep saying that." "I know." "So explain now." "I can't." "Why not?" Tiffany looked away. "I just can't." Thomas stared at her, completely confused. "This is our money." "I know." "Then why am I the last person who knows where it's going?" She wanted to answer. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to explain the paperwork, the insurance problem, the hospital calls, and the promise she had made to Paige. Instead, she quietly repeated the only words she believed would protect everyone. "Please, trust me." Thomas's shoulders stiffened. "I do trust you." His voice was calm. "But trust doesn't grow in silence." He walked out onto the back porch, leaving Tiffany standing alone in the kitchen. For the first time since they had married, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the woman he loved was keeping an important part of her life hidden from him. He didn't know what she was hiding, but he had begun to believe she was hiding something. The promise Tiffany made to Paige stayed with her every waking hour. She didn't think about it only at work. She thought about it while making breakfast, while driving through Tampa traffic, while folding laundry. Even in the quiet moments before falling asleep, her mind replayed every possible outcome. She knew the insurance issue wouldn't solve itself. If she waited too long, the financial consequences could become overwhelming. So instead of hoping things would somehow improve, she began building a plan. The following Monday, she arrived at the hospital nearly an hour before her shift officially began. The lobby was still quiet. Cleaning crews were finishing their rounds. Volunteers arranged information brochures, and only a handful of patients had arrived for early appointments. Tiffany carried her coffee into her office, opened her computer, and logged into the system she worked with every day. Only this time, she wasn't thinking like an employee. She was thinking like a daughter, trying to protect her family. During her morning break, she called the hospital's financial counseling department. She explained Paige's situation carefully, making sure she had permission to discuss the necessary details. The counselor listened patiently before outlining several assistance programs that might help reduce the cost of future treatment if Paige qualified. Tiffany wrote everything down. Application, deadlines, required documents, income verification, supporting paperwork. Every detail mattered. When the call ended, she didn't feel relieved. She simply knew where to begin. That evening, instead of driving straight home, she stopped at Paige's house, carrying a small folder. "I made a checklist," Tiffany said, as she spread several papers across the dining room table. Paige adjusted her reading glasses. "What are all these?" "Some are financial assistance applications." She pointed to another document. "This one lists the paperwork we'll need." Another page. "This explains income verification." Another. "And this covers payment options while everything is being reviewed." Paige looked overwhelmed. "I never realized there was so much involved." "Most people don't. I don't even understand half of these forms." "You don't have to." Tiffany smiled reassuringly. "I'll handle them." Paige looked at her with grateful eyes. "You've already done more than enough. We're only getting started." Over the next several weeks, Tiffany developed a routine that no one else noticed. She worked her regular schedule during the day. During lunch breaks, she made phone calls. After work, she stopped by Paige's house to collect documents or signatures. Late at night, while Thomas slept upstairs, she sat quietly at the dining room table, reviewing applications line by line to make sure nothing had been missed. Some evenings stretched well past midnight. Stacks of neatly organized folders slowly replaced what had once been a clear dining table. One folder held insurance correspondence. Another contained hospital estimates. Another tracked prescription costs. Another listed every phone conversation she had completed, including names, dates, reference numbers, and promised follow-ups. She trusted organization more than memory. Whenever a counselor requested another document, she already knew exactly where to find it. Several applications required supporting financial records. Others requested copies of identification. Some required signed authorization forms. Each completed step brought a small sense of progress. Each unanswered request created another obstacle. Still, Tiffany refused to become discouraged. One afternoon, while reviewing paperwork during her lunch break, she received encouraging news. One hospital representative confirmed that Paige appeared eligible to apply for significant financial assistance if all required documentation was approved. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope. Tiffany quietly smiled to herself before returning to work. She never mentioned that phone call at home. As the weeks passed, another change quietly took place. Tiffany volunteered for additional shifts whenever they became available. If someone called in sick, she offered to stay. If another department needed temporary help, she accepted. The extra hours were exhausting, but every additional paycheck gave her another layer of protection if unexpected expenses appeared before financial assistance decisions were finalized. Thomas noticed. "You've been working a lot lately. We've been busy. You've worked 3 weekends this month." "I don't mind." "You always minded before." She forced a smile. "It's temporary." He wanted to believe her. He truly did, but something about her answer felt incomplete. One evening, Tiffany stopped by Paige's home carrying another envelope. "I need one more signature." Paige laughed softly. "I think I've signed my name more this month than during the previous 5 years." Almost finished. Paige signed the final page before setting the pen down. She watched Tiffany carefully organize every document into labeled folders. "You've become awfully good at carrying other people's burdens." Tiffany looked up. "I learned from someone." Paige smiled sadly. "I should have told Thomas." "You were frightened." "I still am." "You won't face this alone." Paige lowered her eyes. "He's going to be angry when he eventually learns I kept this from him." Tiffany remained quiet, not because she disagreed, because she feared Paige might be right. A few nights later, Tiffany returned home carrying several sealed envelopes. The moment she stepped inside, she heard the garage door opening. Thomas was home earlier than expected. Without thinking, Tiffany slipped the envelopes into a desk drawer before greeting him. He noticed the movement immediately. "What was that?" She turned. "What?" "You just put something away." "Oh." She hesitated. "Just paperwork." "What kind?" "Nothing important." Thomas studied her face. She rarely avoided eye contact. Tonight, she did. He didn't press the issue, but he remembered it. Days later, while searching for a warranty booklet, Thomas opened the same desk drawer. Inside sat several neatly arranged folders. Hospital logos covered the front of nearly every envelope. Financial assistance, insurance correspondence, billing notices. Before he could read further, Tiffany walked into the room carrying a basket of laundry. Their eyes met instantly. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Thomas closed the drawer. "I wasn't looking for those." "I know." "What are they?" "They're work papers." He looked unconvinced. "You don't usually bring this much work home." "I've had extra projects. Every single week?" She nodded. He wanted to ask more questions. Instead, he simply walked away. The silence between them felt heavier than another argument would have. Over the following days, Thomas became quieter. He still kissed Tiffany goodbye before work. He still thanked her for dinner. They still sat together every evening. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Inside, however, uncertainty had begun replacing confidence. He couldn't understand why the woman who had once shared everything with him now guarded simple conversations so carefully. Tiffany noticed the distance, too. More than once, she almost told him the truth. She even rehearsed the conversation in her mind while driving home from work. She imagined explaining Paige's missed paperwork, the applications, the phone calls, the extra shifts, the growing pile of documents. Every time she reached the front door, she remembered the promise she had made. Don't tell Thomas yet. Breaking that promise didn't feel right. Keeping it, however, was quietly changing her marriage. One Sunday afternoon, the family gathered for lunch at Paige's house. Conversation flowed easily enough. Thomas discussed an upcoming commercial installation. Paige shared stories from church. Tiffany smiled whenever someone looked her way. But there were moments when her attention drifted. She mentally reviewed deadlines while pretending to listen. She checked the time more often than usual. She excused herself twice to answer phone calls she described only as work. Thomas watched every one of those moments. Driving home later that afternoon, he finally spoke. "You're somewhere else lately." "I'm just tired." "No." He kept his eyes on the road. "You're carrying something." She remained silent. "I wish you'd let me carry it with you." Tiffany looked out the passenger window. "I will." "When?" She couldn't answer. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the drive. That quiet ride home lasted less than 30 minutes. Yet it marked the beginning of a distance neither of them knew how to close. For the first time since they had built a life together, Thomas found himself wondering whether the silence between them had grown too deep for love alone to overcome. The quiet drive home, after Thomas admitted he wished Tiffany would let him share whatever burden she was carrying, marked a turning point neither of them fully recognized. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. There were no slammed doors, no shouting matches that echoed through the house, no single event that changed everything. Instead, the distance between them grew through small moments that barely seemed important on their own. Morning conversations became shorter. Meals were quieter. The easy laughter that had once filled their evenings visited less often. Life simply became heavier. As autumn settled across Tampa, Thomas noticed that the household budget no longer stretched as comfortably as it once had. Fuel prices for his HVAC trucks had climbed again. Several commercial clients delayed payments, forcing him to cover payroll before receiving invoices himself. Every business owner expected slow seasons from time to time. But lately it felt as though every unexpected expense arrived before the previous one had been resolved. One evening he sat alone at the kitchen table with a calculator, bank statements spread neatly beside him. He wasn't careless with money. He tracked nearly every dollar that entered or left their accounts. That was why the growing pressure unsettled him so deeply. When Tiffany walked into the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee, she immediately recognized the familiar stack of papers. "Long day?" she asked gently. Thomas managed a tired smile. "You could say that." She placed a mug beside him. "Anything I can do?" He looked down at the numbers again. "I've been trying to figure out why we aren't getting ahead." She pulled out the chair across from him. "We've had extra expenses." "I know." He tapped the calculator with his pencil. "But every month, it feels like something new appears." Tiffany remained quiet. She already knew exactly where some of those missing dollars had gone. Application fees, small prescription costs, certified mail for financial paperwork, parking during Paige's appointments, payments made before reimbursement decisions could be finalized. None of the purchases had been extravagant. Each one had felt necessary. She simply couldn't explain them without breaking the promise she had made to Paige. Thomas looked up. You're somewhere else again. I've just been tired. You've been tired for months. She nodded faintly. I know. You don't sleep much anymore. I've had a lot going on. I wish you'd tell me what it is. The words lingered between them. Tiffany wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. I will. When? She searched for an answer that didn't exist. I just need a little more time. Thomas leaned back in his chair. I feel like that's all we've been saying lately. Neither of them raised their voice. Neither wanted to hurt the other. Yet both walked away feeling unheard. The following week became one of the busiest Thomas had experienced all year. A large commercial installation ran behind schedule after unexpected equipment delays. He spent nearly 12 hours each day moving between job sites, suppliers, and customer meetings. By the time he returned home each evening, exhaustion had replaced patience. Tiffany's days were no easier. Hospital admissions had increased, and families facing medical emergencies filled her schedule from morning until late afternoon. Many arrived frightened by diagnoses they barely understood. Others were overwhelmed by paperwork and insurance questions. Tiffany listened to each story with compassion, helping strangers find solutions while quietly carrying her own worries home every night. More than once, she found herself staring at a patient's file before realizing she hadn't read the last paragraph. Fatigue had begun following her everywhere. One Thursday evening, Thomas arrived home to find Tiffany sitting at the dining room table with her laptop open. Several folders lay beside her. The moment she heard the front door, she closed the computer. Thomas noticed immediately. You always close it when I come in. She looked surprised. I wasn't trying to hide anything. It feels that way. It's habit. No. His tone remained calm. It isn't. She stood slowly. I'm making dinner. Tiff. She stopped. I'm not accusing you of anything. I know. But I don't understand what's happening anymore. She lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. For what? For making you worry. Then help me stop worrying. Silence answered him again. That silence hurt far more than another disagreement would have. Days later, Paige invited them over for Sunday lunch, as she always did. She insisted she was feeling well enough to cook, despite Tiffany offering several times to bring food instead. The familiar smell of roasted chicken welcomed them through the front door. For a little while, conversation felt almost normal. Thomas described a customer who insisted an old thermostat had developed a personality. Paige laughed, until tears gathered in the corners of her eyes. Tiffany smiled along with them. But even while smiling, her attention drifted whenever her phone vibrated inside her purse. She ignored the first notification, then the second. By the third, she quietly excused herself. I'll only be a minute. She stepped onto the back porch. Thomas watched through the kitchen window as she answered the call with her back turned toward the house. She spoke softly enough that he couldn't hear a single word. When she returned several minutes later, Paige looked carefully between the two of them. Everything appeared polite. Everything appeared normal. Yet something had changed. A mother didn't need words to recognize the growing distance between her son and daughter-in-law. After lunch, Thomas volunteered to wash the dishes, while Tiffany stepped outside to carry leftovers to the car. Paige quietly dried a serving bowl before speaking. Is everything all right? Thomas kept his eyes on the sink. Why do you ask? You haven't looked at each other the same way all afternoon. He forced a smile. We're just both busy. Paige didn't answer immediately. She had spent decades helping children find the right books as a librarian. Over the years, she had also become unusually good at recognizing the stories people never said aloud. She's a good woman. I know. And she loves you. I know that too. So whatever this is. She gently placed a hand on his arm. Don't let silence tell the story for you. Thomas nodded politely. I'll figure it out. But he wasn't sure he believed his own words anymore. Outside, Tiffany stood beside the car staring across Paige's small flower garden. The phone call had been another request for supporting documents, another deadline, another reminder that the process wasn't over. She took a slow breath before returning inside. As she stepped through the kitchen door, Paige noticed the strain Tiffany could no longer hide behind a smile. Later that afternoon, while Thomas loaded containers into the trunk, Paige gently touched Tiffany's hand. "He's hurting." "I know. So are you." Tiffany's eyes filled with emotion. "I'm trying to protect everyone." "I know you are. I'm afraid if I explain everything now, it'll only make things worse." Paige squeezed her hand. "This wasn't supposed to become your burden. It isn't your fault. I asked you to keep my mistake between us. You asked because you were frightened." Paige looked down. "I never wanted it to cost you your peace." Tiffany offered a reassuring smile despite the exhaustion written across her face. "We're going to get through this." "You really believe that?" "I have to. Because if I stop believing it—" She paused before quietly finishing her thought. "I don't know how I'd keep going." On the drive home, Thomas focused on the road, while Tiffany watched neighborhoods pass through the passenger window. Neither knew how to begin another conversation that seemed destined to end the same way. The silence between them no longer felt temporary. It had quietly become part of their everyday life. For the first time since they married, Thomas found himself wondering whether love alone could survive when two people stopped sharing the weight they carried. Monday arrived before Tiffany felt ready for it. She had barely slept. Long after Thomas drifted off the night before, she remained awake beside him, staring at the ceiling while mentally reviewing every deadline she needed to meet that week. There were applications waiting for supporting documents, billing representatives expecting return calls, and medical records that still required authorization before another review could move forward. When her alarm sounded just before sunrise, it felt as though she had only closed her eyes a few minutes earlier. She quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Thomas. As she reached the kitchen, she paused for a moment, looking toward the dining table where neatly labeled folders still occupied one end. Every folder represented another step toward protecting Paige from a financial burden she could never manage alone. After pouring herself a cup of coffee, Tiffany opened the first folder and reviewed her checklist one final time before leaving for work. Every task had a purpose. Every signature mattered. Every deadline carried consequences. There was no room for mistakes. The hospital was already busy when Tiffany arrived. Families checked in at reception. Volunteers guided visitors through the main lobby. Phones rang almost constantly inside the revenue cycle department. For everyone else, it was another ordinary workday. For Tiffany, every break between assignments became another opportunity to move Paige's case forward. During her morning break, she stepped into a quiet office and called the hospital's financial counseling department. "Good morning. This is Tiffany Carter," she said politely. "I'm calling to follow up regarding Paige Parker's financial assistance application." The representative immediately recognized the file. "I have it here." Tiffany reached for her notebook. "Has everything been received?" "We've received most of the documentation." "Most?" "We still need proof of last year's retirement income." "I can provide that today." "Once that's submitted, we'll continue processing the application." "Thank you." She ended the call and immediately added another note to her growing checklist. No frustration, no complaints, just another step. That afternoon, she visited Paige after work. The older woman already had the requested paperwork waiting on the kitchen table. "I found everything," Paige said, handing over several neatly folded documents. "You've made my job easier." "I wish I could make all of it easier." Tiffany smiled. "You're already helping." Paige watched her carefully review every page. "I still don't understand how you keep all this organized." "I've learned that paperwork tells a story." "What do you mean?" "If one page is missing, the whole story becomes harder to understand." Paige laughed softly. "That's the most hospital answer I've ever heard." Tiffany laughed too. For just a few seconds, the pressure surrounding them seemed lighter. Before leaving, Tiffany placed the completed documents back into the folder. One more step finished. How many more? She thought for a moment. Fewer than last week. It wasn't the complete answer Paige wanted, but it was enough to keep hope alive. Over the next several weeks, Tiffany became a familiar voice to billing offices throughout the hospital system. She learned which representatives handled payment plans. She learned which departments processed charity reviews. She learned who returned calls quickly and who required patient follow-up. Every conversation ended the same way. Thank you for your time. Kindness often accomplished more than frustration ever could. Little by little, progress appeared. One account was temporarily placed on hold while assistance was reviewed. Another qualified for reduced charges. Several upcoming services could proceed without immediate payment because Tiffany had submitted the necessary documentation before their deadlines expired. Each small victory removed another obstacle. She celebrated none of them. No one else even knew they had happened. One Friday afternoon, another call brought even better news. The application has entered its final review, the financial counselor explained. Is there anything else you need from us? Not at the moment. So now we wait? Yes. Tiffany thanked the counselor before ending the call. She quietly closed her office door and allowed herself one slow breath. For the first time in weeks, the finish line finally felt visible. Still, there were expenses that couldn't wait. Prescription costs arrived before assistance decisions. Transportation to appointments still required fuel. Small copays appeared without warning. Whenever those bills arrived, Tiffany quietly paid what she could. Sometimes it meant postponing something she wanted for herself. A dress she had planned to buy for a friend's anniversary dinner stayed on the store rack. A weekend getaway Thomas had casually suggested never happened because she quietly redirected the money elsewhere. When co-workers invited her out after work, she politely declined. I've got a few things to finish at home. It became her standard answer. No one questioned it. At home, Thomas noticed the changes in different ways. You never take time for yourself anymore, he said one evening while they folded laundry together. I've just been busy. You always say that. She smiled faintly. I know. You used to love Friday nights. I still do. Then why do they all look the same now? She didn't answer immediately, because every Friday night had become another opportunity to organize paperwork, return phone calls, review bills, or prepare documents for Monday morning. Instead, she simply said, "It won't be like this forever." Thomas nodded. He wanted to believe her. But lately, every promise seemed to arrive without an explanation. As October gave way to November, the long hours began leaving visible marks on Tiffany. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes. She sometimes forgot where she placed simple things, like her keys or phone. One afternoon, she caught herself rereading the same email 4 times before realizing she hadn't absorbed a single sentence. Even Paige noticed. You've lost weight, she said quietly during another appointment. I've been skipping lunch once in a while. Tiffany, I'm all right. No. Paige gently reached across the waiting room and took her hand. You're wearing yourself down. I'm just tired. You're carrying all of this because of me. Tiffany immediately shook her head. I'm carrying it because we're family. I never wanted this. I know. I wish I could take some of this weight off your shoulders. You already do. How? You remind me why it's worth fighting. Paige's eyes filled with tears. She looked away before speaking again. I don't know what Thomas would think if he knew everything you've done. Tiffany's smile carried both warmth and sadness. I didn't do any of it, so someone would thank me. She looked toward the reception desk, where another family anxiously waited to check in. I only wanted to make sure you could focus on getting better instead of worrying about bills. That simple sentence captured everything driving Tiffany forward. Not recognition, not appreciation, only protection. Late one evening, after Thomas had gone upstairs, Tiffany remained at the dining room table reviewing one final statement. She compared every balance against her handwritten notes before carefully placing a check into an envelope for one remaining payment that couldn't be delayed. She sealed it, wrote the mailing address, and set it beside her purse for the following morning. When she finally looked at the clock, it was well past midnight. The house had been silent for hours. She rubbed her tired eyes before switching off the kitchen light. As she climbed the stairs, she paused outside the bedroom door. Thomas was already asleep. For a moment, she simply watched him. She wished she could sit beside him and explain every late night, every missing dollar, every phone call, and every promise she had made. Instead, she quietly slipped into bed without making a sound. Thomas never stirred. He didn't know that while he worried about the growing distance in their marriage, Tiffany had been fighting every single day to protect the woman who had welcomed her into the family as a daughter. Her greatest victories remained invisible, and the silence surrounding those victories was becoming more expensive than any hospital bill. Winter arrived quietly in Tampa. The mornings were cooler, though the afternoons still carried enough warmth for people to eat lunch on restaurant patios and children to play in neighborhood parks. Life appeared to settle into a routine again. Thomas buried himself in work. Tiffany continued balancing her job with Paige's growing medical responsibilities. Paige did her best to convince everyone that she was feeling stronger. "I've had more good days than bad this week," she told them one Sunday afternoon. She smiled as she poured coffee into 3 familiar mugs. "I think all these doctor visits are finally paying off." Thomas looked relieved. "That's the best thing I've heard all month." Tiffany smiled too, though she noticed Paige rested one hand against the edge of the kitchen counter a little longer than usual before sitting down. It was a small detail, one most people would never notice. Tiffany did. Over the next several days, Paige insisted on keeping life as normal as possible. She watered her flowers each morning. She attended Sunday service whenever she felt strong enough. She even joked with neighbors while collecting her mail. But every now and then, she paused, catching her breath before continuing whatever she had been doing. Whenever Tiffany asked if she should call the doctor, Paige always answered the same way. "I've already got another appointment next week. You don't have to wait if something feels wrong. I'll be all right." Tiffany wanted to believe her. She truly did. But experience had taught her that serious medical conditions didn't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they whispered until they couldn't anymore. 3 days later, Tiffany left work a little earlier than usual. She planned to stop by Paige's house before heading home. The financial counselor had called that afternoon with encouraging news. Paige's assistance application was moving toward final approval. Tiffany couldn't wait to tell her. She pulled into the driveway just after 4 o'clock. Paige's front door was unlocked, exactly as it usually was whenever she expected family. "Mom?" Tiffany called as she stepped inside. No answer. She set her purse on the kitchen counter. "Paige?" Still nothing. Then she heard it, a sharp gasp from somewhere deeper inside the house. Tiffany hurried down the hallway. She found Paige leaning against the living room sofa, one arm wrapped tightly around her abdomen. Her face had lost nearly all its color. "Tiffany." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "It hurts." Tiffany rushed to her side. "What happened?" "I was putting laundry away." Paige struggled to breathe through another wave of pain. "It just started." She tried to stand straighter, but immediately doubled over. This wasn't the discomfort Tiffany had seen over the previous months. This was different. The pain had arrived suddenly, violently. Paige's breathing became shallow. Sweat formed across her forehead, despite the cool temperature inside the house. Tiffany gently helped her onto the couch. "Stay with me." Paige nodded weakly. "My back." She closed her eyes. "It hurts too." Tiffany's heart began racing. She remembered enough from years of working around healthcare to recognize that severe abdominal pain combined with sudden back pain in someone Page's age demanded immediate attention. She reached for her phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered almost immediately. 911. What's your emergency? My mother-in-law is having sudden severe abdominal pain. Is she awake? Yes. Is she breathing normally? She's breathing, but she's struggling. What's the address? Tiffany answered every question as calmly as she could, while keeping one hand on Page's shoulder. The dispatcher instructed her not to give Page anything to eat or drink, and assured her that paramedics were already on the way. It's going to be okay, Tiffany whispered. Page looked at her with frightened eyes. I don't want to die. The words caught Tiffany completely off guard. She immediately took Page's hand. Don't think like that. It feels... Page stopped as another wave of pain stole her breath. It feels different. You stay with me. Tiffany squeezed her hand gently. Help is almost here. Outside, the distant sound of sirens grew louder. Within moments, an ambulance pulled into the driveway. 2 paramedics entered carrying equipment, while another firefighter followed close behind. They quickly introduced themselves before kneeling beside Page. One began checking her blood pressure. Another attached heart monitor leads, while asking rapid but reassuring questions. When did the pain begin? About 10 minutes. Has this happened before? No. Where is the pain strongest? My stomach. She winced. And my back. The paramedics exchanged a quick glance. One of them gently pressed different areas of Page's abdomen. She cried out immediately. We need to move. The stretcher was brought inside. With practiced care, they transferred Page onto it while continuing to monitor her condition. As they wheeled her toward the front door, Tiffany grabbed Page's purse, identification, medication list, and the folder containing her recent medical paperwork. She climbed into the ambulance beside her. As the doors closed, she quickly pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled as she searched for Thomas's name. He answered on the second ring. Hey, Tiff? Thomas. The fear in her voice erased any sense of normal conversation. Where are you? I'm finishing up a service call. It's your mom. A long pause followed. What happened? She collapsed. What? We're on the way to the hospital. Is she all right? I don't know. Thomas's breathing became uneven. Which hospital? Tampa General. I'm leaving right now. He didn't ask another question. The call ended. Inside the ambulance, Page remained conscious, though every bump in the road seemed to intensify her pain. Tiffany stayed beside her, speaking softly. You remember what we talked about? Page managed a faint nod. Just keep looking at me. The ambulance arrived at Tampa General within minutes. The emergency department doors opened before the vehicle had completely stopped. Doctors, nurses, and emergency staff immediately surrounded the stretcher. Medical questions filled the air. Blood pressure? Pain scale? History? What medications? Tiffany answered everything she knew while staff moved Page toward an examination room. Within minutes, emergency imaging was ordered. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Tiffany waited just outside the room, watching nurses move quickly from one patient to another. Every passing minute felt longer than the one before it. Finally, an emergency physician stepped into the hallway. His expression remained calm but serious. Ms. Carter? Yes. The scan shows that Page has a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. Tiffany felt the words settle heavily between them. The physician continued carefully. The artery has ruptured. He paused only long enough to ensure she understood. She needs emergency surgery immediately. For a brief moment, the sounds around Tiffany seemed to fade. The busy hallway disappeared beneath the weight of a single realization. Everything they had fought so hard to prepare for had suddenly become a race against time. Before she could gather her thoughts, another team arrived, already preparing to transfer Page toward the operating suite. Just then, The emergency department doors burst open. Thomas hurried inside, his work shirt still marked with dust from the day's installations. His eyes searched desperately until they found Tiffany. What happened? She looked at him, fighting to keep her composure. The doctors know what's wrong. He stepped closer. What did they say? She swallowed hard. They have to operate now. Without another word, both of them turned toward the moving hospital bed as surgeons and nurses guided Paige through the hallway toward the operating room. Neither husband nor wife realized that before the day was over, the greatest test facing their family would no longer be the surgery itself. For now, all they could do was watch as the operating room doors slowly closed behind Paige. The operating room doors closed with a quiet click. For a long moment, neither Thomas nor Tiffany moved. They stood side by side in the hallway, staring at the red light above the entrance, as though looking long enough might somehow shorten the wait. It didn't. A nurse approached them with a calm, practiced smile. The surgeons are beginning the procedure now. Thomas nodded quickly. How long will it take? It's difficult to say. She spoke gently. Several hours, most likely. If there's any change, we'll update you as soon as we can. After she disappeared behind another set of doors, the hallway grew strangely quiet. Thomas lowered himself into one of the waiting room chairs. His elbows rested on his knees, while both hands covered his face. Everything had happened so quickly that he hadn't fully processed it. Only an hour earlier, he had been repairing an air conditioning unit across town. Now his mother was fighting for her life. Across the room, Tiffany remained standing. She looked toward the operating room once more, before quietly sitting several seats away. Not because she wanted distance from Thomas, because she knew he needed space to absorb what was happening. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The waiting room clock seemed unusually loud. Families came and went. A television mounted in one corner displayed a daytime talk show with the volume turned almost completely down. Someone walked past carrying flowers. Another family quietly held hands while whispering a prayer. Life inside the hospital continued. For those waiting outside the operating room, time seemed almost frozen. Thomas finally broke the silence. She looked scared. Tiffany nodded. She was. I've never seen her like that. Neither had Tiffany. She thought about the moment Paige admitted she didn't want to die. The memory settled heavily inside her chest. I should have noticed something sooner, Thomas said quietly. You couldn't have known. I keep thinking about all those Sundays. He stared at the floor. Every time she said she was fine. He stopped speaking. Tiffany understood exactly what he meant. Paige had spent months trying to protect the people she loved. Now everyone was carrying the weight she had tried so hard to hide. An hour passed. Then another. Every so often, nurses entered the waiting area to call another family. Each time the doors opened, Thomas looked up immediately. Each time they called another name. Disappointment quietly settled back into the room. Late that afternoon, Tiffany's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. The call came from the hospital's financial counseling department. She hesitated. Under different circumstances, she would have ignored it. But she knew delaying the conversation could create complications for Paige's care once surgery was over. She stood. I'll be right back. Thomas barely looked up. She stepped into a quieter hallway before answering. This is Tiffany. Miss Carter, thank you for returning our earlier messages. The financial counselor's voice remained professional but kind. I know today has been extremely difficult. It has. I'll keep this brief. I appreciate that. We've completed another review of Paige Parker's account. Tiffany reached for the notebook she carried almost everywhere. I'm ready. There are a few final items we need to confirm. She listened carefully as the counselor reviewed account balances, pending adjustments, previously submitted documentation, and assistance already applied to several charges. Every figure matched the notes Tiffany had carefully maintained over the previous months. You've done an excellent job keeping everything organized, the counselor said. That made today's review much easier. I'm just trying to make sure nothing gets overlooked. It hasn't. The counselor explained that once surgery-related charges were entered into the system, the remaining financial review could move toward completion without unnecessary delays. Tiffany thanked her sincerely before ending the call. She looked down at her notebook for a moment. One final checklist remained. She returned to the waiting room. Thomas glanced up. "Everything okay?" It was work. He nodded without asking another question. But something about her answer lingered in his mind. Another hour passed. A surgeon finally entered the waiting room, still wearing surgical scrubs and a protective cap. Thomas stood so quickly that his chair slid backward. "Doctor, the operation is still in progress." The surgeon removed his glasses briefly. "Paige is stable at the moment, but the repair is complex." Thomas swallowed hard. "Is she going to make it?" "We're doing everything we can." He looked at both of them. "Right now, she's responding the way we'd hoped." It wasn't a promise, but it was enough to help them breathe a little easier. As soon as the surgeon returned to the operating suite, Tiffany quietly excused herself once more. This time, she headed toward the financial services office, located on another floor of the hospital. She moved quickly through familiar hallways. Although today she was here as family rather than an employee, she knew exactly where to go. The counselor she had spoken with earlier was waiting with several documents. "I wanted to save you another trip. Thank you." The counselor placed the paperwork on the desk. "These are the remaining authorization forms connected to today's treatment." Tiffany reviewed each page carefully before signing where required. Next came an updated estimate reflecting preliminary insurance processing, previously approved adjustments, and temporary payment arrangements already in place. The remaining balance was dramatically lower than it would have been only months earlier. Every late night, every application, every phone call, every carefully completed form, they had all led to this moment. "There is one remaining patient responsibility amount," the counselor explained. "It can be paid now or included in the payment arrangement while the final review finishes." Tiffany opened her wallet. "I'll take care of it now." "You don't have to decide today." "I know." She removed her debit card. "I'd rather handle it." The transaction took less than a minute. When the receipt printed, Tiffany folded it neatly and placed it inside her folder beside every other document she had collected throughout the previous months. The counselor looked at her with quiet admiration. "Your mother-in-law is fortunate to have someone willing to work this hard for her." Tiffany offered a tired smile. "She's family." As she walked back toward the waiting room, she allowed herself one deep breath. For the first time since Paige's insurance problem had come to light, she felt as though she had finally managed to keep the promise she made around Paige's kitchen table. She had done everything she could. When Tiffany stepped back into the waiting area, Thomas immediately noticed the folder tucked beneath her arm. He noticed the receipt she carefully slipped inside before closing it. He noticed the relief that briefly crossed her face. From where he sat, he couldn't hear the conversation she had just finished. He couldn't see the paperwork. He didn't know about the applications completed months earlier. He didn't know about the reduced balances, the assistance approvals already in progress, the payment arrangements, or the sacrifices Tiffany had quietly made from their own household budget. He saw only what had become painfully familiar over recent months. More paperwork. Another private conversation. Another financial discussion she hadn't shared with him. His mother was still in surgery. His marriage felt like it was slipping through his hands. And somehow, once again, Tiffany had chosen to face another important moment alone. Thomas leaned back slowly in his chair. The thought settled heavily in his mind. Maybe she no longer trusted him enough to let him be part of her life. Maybe she hadn't for a long time. He looked toward the operating room doors once more. For the first time, the fear of losing his mother was no longer the only heartbreak weighing on him. He began to believe he had already lost his wife. The waiting continued for nearly another 2 hours. Outside the operating suite, daylight slowly faded beyond the hospital windows, leaving the corridor lit only by soft overhead lights and the glow from nurses' stations farther down the hall. Thomas had barely left his chair. He had stopped checking the time. Each passing minute felt impossible to measure. Across the room, Tiffany quietly reviewed the folder resting on her lap one last time before closing it. There was nothing more to organize, nothing more to submit. For the first time in months, every form she could complete had been completed. Now all she could do was wait. A set of doors finally opened. The surgeon stepped into the hallway, removed his surgical cap, and looked directly toward them. Thomas stood immediately. "So?" The surgeon smiled for the first time all day. "The repair was successful." Neither Thomas nor Tiffany spoke. For a brief second, relief arrived too suddenly to process. "We were able to stop the bleeding," the surgeon continued. "The next 24 to 48 hours will still be very important, but she made it through surgery." Thomas closed his eyes. His shoulders dropped as though someone had lifted an enormous weight from them. "Can we see her?" "She'll be transferred to the intensive care unit shortly." The surgeon glanced between them. "She'll still be heavily sedated. One of the nurses will come for you once she's settled." "Thank you," Thomas managed. "No." His voice caught. "Thank you." The surgeon gave a small nod before walking away. Thomas remained where he stood for several seconds. He wiped both hands across his face before releasing a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Tiffany smiled gently. "She's still with us." Thomas nodded without looking at her. "Yeah." It was the first hopeful sentence either of them had spoken in hours. A nurse arrived a short time later. "We're ready to move Paige into ICU." Thomas and Tiffany followed at a respectful distance as hospital staff carefully guided Paige's bed through the hallway. Machines surrounded her, clear tubing connected to monitors. Bandages covered the surgical site beneath several layers of blankets. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor became the only sound Thomas truly heard. His mother looked smaller than he remembered, older, fragile. The nurse stopped outside a private ICU room. "We're still getting everything connected." She smiled kindly. "It'll only take another few minutes." Thomas stood outside the doorway, watching nurses adjust equipment around Paige's bed. Tiffany quietly stepped back, giving him space. She knew no words could lessen what he was feeling. After several minutes, the nurse invited them inside. Thomas approached the bedside first. He carefully wrapped his fingers around Paige's hand. "Hey, Mom." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "You scared me." Paige remained asleep, beneath the effects of anesthesia. The heart monitor answered with its steady rhythm. Thomas smiled sadly. "You always told me not to worry." He gently brushed a strand of gray hair away from her forehead. "I should have listened when you said something wasn't right." Behind him, Tiffany stood near the window, giving the moment to mother and son. Watching them together reminded her exactly why every sacrifice had mattered. Paige had another chance. That was all Tiffany had wanted from the beginning. The nurse quietly checked several monitors before speaking. "She'll need plenty of rest." Thomas nodded. "We understand. If anything changes, we'll let you know immediately." As the nurse left the room, silence settled once again. Thomas finally turned toward Tiffany. She offered him a small, tired smile. "I'm glad you made it here in time." "So am I." Another silence followed. This one felt different, not peaceful, unfinished. Thomas looked at the folder Tiffany still carried beneath her arm. "You've had that thing with you all day." She looked down. "I know. You've been working on paperwork while my mom was in surgery." His words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Tiffany immediately understood where the conversation was heading. "It wasn't what you think." "I don't know what to think anymore." She took one careful step toward him. "I was trying to make sure everything was taken care of." "You've been saying that for months." "I know. You always have another explanation." "I've wanted to tell you, but you never do." His voice remained controlled, though years of frustration had begun finding their way into every sentence. I ask questions. You tell me to trust you. I try. You ask for more time. I wait. You disappear into another phone call. He looked directly into her eyes. Do you know what that feels like? Tiffany lowered her head. I never meant to hurt you. But you did. His answer came immediately. I've spent months wondering what happened to us. She searched for the right words. They're complicated. They don't have to be. Thomas. No. He shook his head slowly. I've defended you every single time someone said something felt different. I know. I kept telling myself I was imagining it. You weren't. I kept believing there had to be a reason. There is. Then why won't you tell me? She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Not because she lacked an explanation, because the promise she had made to Paige still echoed in her mind. Don't tell Thomas yet. That promise had carried her through months of difficult decisions. Now it stood between her marriage and the truth. Thomas watched her remain silent once again. His disappointment settled into something quieter, something heavier. I can't keep living like this. Tiffany felt her heart sink. What are you saying? He reached inside the messenger bag he had carried from work earlier that afternoon. Slowly, he removed a large, sealed envelope. Tiffany frowned. What is that? Thomas looked at it for a long moment before answering. I hoped I'd never need it. He handed it toward her. She accepted it without understanding. When she opened the flap and pulled out the documents inside, her hands began to tremble. The title across the first page stole the air from her lungs. Petition for dissolution of marriage. She stared at the paperwork, then back at Thomas. Her voice came out almost as a whisper. You brought divorce papers? I brought them before surgery. Her eyes widened. You planned this? I planned it after months of believing I'd already lost my wife. Tears immediately gathered in Tiffany's eyes. You think I don't love you anymore? I don't know what to think. You never even asked me one last time. I've been asking for months. His own eyes had become red. I asked every night you said you were tired. I asked every time you walked away to answer another call. I asked every time you told me you'd explain later. He looked toward Paige, sleeping peacefully inside the ICU room. I couldn't compete with whatever you've chosen to keep from me. Tiffany clutched the papers tightly. This isn't another person. I never said it was. Then why? Because marriage isn't supposed to feel like living beside a stranger. The words struck harder than shouting ever could. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The steady sound of Paige's heart monitor filled the silence. Finally, Thomas stepped backward. I don't expect you to sign them today. His voice had become quiet again. I just needed you to know where I am. He looked at Tiffany one final time. I still love you. His next words hurt even more. But I don't know how to keep loving someone who won't let me stand beside her. Without waiting for an answer, Thomas turned and walked out of the ICU. Tiffany remained exactly where she was. The papers trembled in her hands. She wanted to run after him. She wanted to explain every late night, every application, every payment, every promise, every sacrifice. Instead, she stood frozen between the husband she loved and the promise she had refused to break. As Thomas disappeared down the hallway, Tiffany quietly lowered herself into one of the waiting room chairs outside the ICU. The divorce papers rested unopened across her lap. She watched him walk away until he disappeared around the corner. Only then did the first tear fall. Tiffany didn't realize how long she had been sitting outside the intensive care unit. The hallway had grown quieter. Several visitors had already gone home for the evening, while others settled into uncomfortable chairs, preparing for another long night inside the hospital. The divorce papers still rested across her lap. She hadn't read beyond the first page. She couldn't. Every time she looked down, Thomas's words echoed through her mind. Marriage isn't supposed to feel like living beside a stranger. She closed the folder and pressed both hands against it, as though holding it together might somehow keep everything else from falling apart. Inside the ICU, Paige slept peacefully under the careful watch of nurses and monitors. Outside, Tiffany sat completely alone. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to stop. There were no forms left to complete, no deadlines left to meet, no billing office waiting for another phone call, no application requiring another signature. She had reached the end of a journey that had consumed nearly every waking hour. And somehow, instead of feeling relieved, she felt as though she had lost everything that mattered. Her phone vibrated gently. She glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed the financial counseling department. For a brief moment, she considered letting the call go to voicemail. Instead, she answered, "Hello." Her voice sounded tired. "Ms. Carter?" "Yes." "This is Angela from Financial Counseling." Tiffany immediately recognized the counselor she had spoken with several times over the previous months. "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "No." Tiffany looked toward the ICU doors. "It's all right. I wanted to personally update you before I left for the evening." Tiffany straightened in her chair. "Okay. I've just received the final review." Without realizing it, Tiffany held her breath. Angela continued, "Paige Parker's financial assistance has officially been approved." For several seconds, Tiffany couldn't speak. Months of paperwork. Months of waiting. Months of uncertainty. Finally, it was finished. "The assistance covered exactly what we expected," Angela explained. "The adjustments have now been posted to the account." Tiffany slowly closed her eyes. "Thank you. There is one more thing." "I'm listening." "I also wanted to let you know that the remaining patient responsibility has already been satisfied." Tiffany frowned slightly. "The remaining balance?" "Yes. The payment you made earlier today completed everything that was still outstanding." Angela paused while reviewing the account one final time. "As of this evening, there are no unpaid hospital balances connected to Paige's treatment that require your attention." The words settled over Tiffany with almost unbelievable gentleness. No unpaid balances, no unexpected bills waiting in the mail, no hidden debt hanging over Paige's recovery. Every promise Tiffany had made months ago had finally been fulfilled. A tear slipped quietly down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. Embarrassed, even though no one could see her, Angela spoke again. "I've worked with many families over the years." Tiffany remained silent. "I don't usually make personal comments." Another pause followed. "But I wanted you to know something." Tiffany listened. "I've watched everything you've done since this process began. You stayed ahead of every deadline. You returned every phone call. You never became impatient with anyone. You found every document we requested. You made arrangements before problems had the chance to become emergencies." Angela's voice softened. "Families often feel overwhelmed by situations like this. You made sure Paige never had to carry that burden." Tiffany looked through the small window into the ICU room. Paige remained asleep, surrounded by machines that were now helping her heal instead of fighting to keep her alive. "I couldn't let her worry about bills while she was worrying about surgery." "I know." Angela hesitated before continuing. "And you quietly covered the remaining costs yourself." Tiffany lowered her eyes. "It wasn't much compared to everything else." "It wasn't the amount," Angela answered gently. "It was the heart behind it." For the first time all evening, Tiffany's composure began to give way. Her shoulders trembled. She covered her mouth with one hand to keep from crying out loud. "I honestly don't know how you managed all of this while working full-time. She stopped. Her voice broke. "I kept telling myself I'd rest after everything was finished." Angela allowed the silence to settle naturally before speaking again. "Well, it's finished now." Tiffany let out a slow, shaky breath. "It doesn't feel finished." Angela sensed There was more beneath those words. "Is everything all right?" Tiffany looked down at the envelope resting beside her. The divorce papers peeked out from beneath the folder she had been carrying for months. "My husband," she struggled to continue. "He thinks I've been hiding things from him." Angela didn't interrupt. "He has no idea why I've been making all those phone calls. He doesn't know about the applications. He doesn't know about the payment plans. He doesn't know why money kept disappearing. He doesn't know any of it." Angela spoke quietly. "So he believes you've simply been shutting him out." Tiffany nodded, even though Angela couldn't see her. "I thought I was protecting everyone, including him. I didn't want him worrying about one more thing." She looked toward the ICU again. "I never imagined my silence would hurt him this much." Angela's voice carried quiet compassion. "Sometimes people only see the part of the story they're standing in." Tiffany stared at the floor. "He handed me divorce papers." There was a brief silence on the other end. "I'm so sorry. He thinks I stopped trusting him." Another tear slipped down Tiffany's face. "The truth is," she smiled sadly through her tears, "I trusted him so much that I wanted to spare him this burden." Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Finally, Angela said softly, "I can't tell you what to do about your marriage, but I can tell you this. You've reached the point where there's nothing left to protect. The financial side is finished. The paperwork is finished. Paige is through surgery. The only thing still carrying weight," she paused gently, "is the truth." After the call ended, Tiffany remained seated in the same chair. The hallway around her hadn't changed. Nurses continued walking past. Elevator doors opened and closed in the distance. A volunteer quietly offered coffee to another waiting family. Everything looked exactly as it had before the phone rang. Yet something inside Tiffany had changed. For months, she had believed silence was an act of love. Tonight she finally understood that silence, even when motivated by kindness, could leave the people closest to her feeling abandoned. She carefully placed her phone inside her purse. Next, she opened the folder that had accompanied her through every appointment, every late night application, every billing office conversation, every payment, and every difficult decision. For the first time, she gathered every receipt, every approval letter, every completed document, and every record into a single organized stack. Then she looked down at the divorce papers resting beside them. Two very different stories lay in front of her. One told the story Thomas believed. The other told the story she had never allowed him to hear. Tiffany gently picked up both folders. She stood slowly, wiped away the last traces of tears from her face, and looked once more through the ICU window at Paige. Then she took a steady breath. She had protected the family for as long as she could through silence. Now she understood that if there was any hope of saving her marriage, the next step could only begin with the truth. Tiffany stood motionless in the ICU hallway. One folder rested beneath her left arm. The divorce papers remained in her right hand. For several seconds she simply looked toward the corridor where Thomas had disappeared. She knew exactly where he had gone. Whenever life became too heavy, Thomas always searched for somewhere quiet before making another difficult decision. It had been one of the first things she learned about him years earlier. He never processed pain in front of a crowd. He carried it alone. Tonight, she couldn't let him do that again. Not when every painful conclusion he had reached had been built upon only half the story. She slipped the divorce papers back into their envelope, secured the folder containing months of financial records against her chest, and walked toward the hospital chapel near the main lobby. The hallway was nearly empty. Night had settled outside, leaving only reflections against the large windows overlooking the city. A volunteer quietly arranged blankets for families spending the night in waiting rooms. Somewhere nearby, an elevator chimed before opening its doors. Everything around Tiffany continued, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet every step she took carried the weight of months she could no longer keep hidden. As she approached the chapel, she found Thomas sitting alone on a wooden bench just outside the entrance. His elbows rested on his knees. His wedding ring caught the light as he rubbed both hands together absent-mindedly. He didn't notice Tiffany until she stopped a few feet away. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence felt different now, not hostile, simply tired. Thomas slowly looked up. "I figured you'd still be with my mom. I checked on her first. How is she?" "The nurse said she's resting comfortably." He nodded. "That's good." Another quiet pause settled between them. Finally, Tiffany spoke. "I can't let you leave tonight believing the story you've been telling yourself." Thomas didn't answer. He simply waited. Tiffany sat beside him, leaving enough space that he wouldn't feel cornered. She carefully placed the thick folder on the bench between them. "You asked me for the truth." "I did. I'm going to tell you everything." She rested both hands on the folder. "But I need you to let me finish before you decide anything." Thomas looked at the envelope containing the divorce papers, then back at Tiffany. "You have my word." For the first time in months, Tiffany didn't hesitate. "It started the afternoon I found one of your mom's insurance letters." Thomas frowned slightly. "The one she never mentioned?" She nodded. The coverage paperwork hadn't been completed. He remained silent. "She showed me everything." She admitted she had started the forms. She thought she'd finish them the next morning. Instead, she forgot. Thomas lowered his eyes. "I had no idea." She was embarrassed. Tiffany's voice remained gentle. She kept saying she'd always handled her own affairs. She couldn't believe she'd made a mistake that serious. Thomas remembered every conversation with his mother during those months. Every smile, every joke, every reassurance that she was managing just fine. Not once had he suspected she was carrying that fear. Tiffany continued. "She asked me not to tell you." Thomas looked up. "You promised her." "Yes." "I thought she'd only need a little help until we fixed everything." She offered a sad smile. "I had no idea how complicated it would become." Thomas listened quietly. There was no anger left in his face, only confusion. Tiffany opened the folder. Inside, every document remained exactly where she had placed it. She removed the first stack. These were the first applications. She carefully handed them to Thomas. They're dated almost 5 months ago. Thomas glanced down. Every page carried Page's information. Every signature matched his mother's handwriting. At the bottom of several forms appeared Tiffany's signature as the authorized family contact. "I spent weeks gathering everything they required." She pointed toward another section. "Income verification." Another. "Supporting records." Another. "Authorization forms." Thomas slowly turned each page. He remembered all the evenings Tiffany had disappeared behind her laptop, the folders he had accidentally found inside the desk, the papers she always closed whenever he entered the room. Every mystery now had a beginning. Tiffany reached for another bundle. "These are notes from every phone call." Thomas looked down in disbelief. Every page contained dates, names of financial counselors, reference numbers, instructions, deadlines, follow-up appointments. Some pages were covered with handwritten notes in the margins. Others listed questions Tiffany had prepared before making another call. "You kept all of this?" "I couldn't afford to forget anything." She looked at him. One missed deadline could have changed everything. Thomas carefully placed the pages back onto the folder. His chest tightened. He remembered accusing her of always being on the phone. Now he understood who she had been calling. "I used my lunch breaks, my mornings before work, my evenings, sometimes even my days off." She smiled faintly. "I became very familiar with every extension number in the financial counseling office." For the first time that night, Thomas almost smiled too, only for a second. Then it disappeared beneath another wave of regret. Tiffany removed another section. This explains the overtime. Thomas looked at several pay stubs. Almost every one showed additional hours. You really worked this much? I volunteered whenever someone needed coverage. You told me the hospital was busy. It was, but I also needed every extra hour I could get. She gently placed several receipts beside the pay stubs. These are prescription co-pays. Another group followed. Parking? Another. Certified mail. Another. Small balances that couldn't wait. Thomas slowly recognized many of the exact amounts he had questioned months earlier while reviewing their bank account. He remembered asking about those withdrawals. He remembered Tiffany quietly saying she would explain later. She hadn't been lying. She simply hadn't been ready to break the promise she made to Paige. Tiffany continued speaking. I contacted financial counselors. I applied for every assistance program your mom qualified for. I negotiated payment arrangements while applications were still under review. I tracked every adjustment. I followed every instruction. I appealed anything that needed another review. She gently placed the final documents into Thomas's hands. This arrived tonight. He unfolded the letter carefully. Across the top appeared the official approval confirming Paige's financial assistance. Below it were the adjusted account summaries. Nearly every overwhelming hospital charge had been reduced through the approved programs Tiffany had spent months pursuing. Thomas stared at the numbers. He could barely process what he was seeing. Tiffany quietly reached into another pocket of the folder. This, she said softly, is the receipt from the payment I made today while your mom was still in surgery. Thomas looked at the receipt, then at her. You paid the remaining balance? She nodded. It was the last amount they needed before everything was completely settled. He looked down again. His eyes drifted over the date. The time, the amount, everything matched exactly with the moment he had watched Tiffany leave the waiting room carrying paperwork. He remembered what he had believed. He remembered thinking she cared more about bills than about him. He remembered convincing himself she had chosen paperwork over their marriage. The truth felt almost unbearable. Finally, Tiffany reached into the folder one last time. She removed a small handwritten note folded neatly in half. I never planned to show anyone this. Thomas accepted it carefully. What is it? It's something your mom wrote after she asked me not to tell you. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Paige's. Thank you for keeping my dignity intact while we figure this out. Please don't tell Thomas until we know what we're facing. I don't want him carrying one more burden. Love, Paige. Thomas read the note twice, then a third time. His hands began to shake. Everything suddenly connected. The late nights, the overtime, the missing money, the paperwork, the quiet phone calls, the exhaustion, the distance, the silence. None of it had been about pushing him away. It had all been about protecting the family he loved. Thomas slowly lowered the note into his lap. For several long moments, he couldn't find a single word. The man who had believed he understood every piece of the story now realized he had only been looking at the empty spaces between the pages. And for the first time since this painful journey had begun, he fully understood how deeply he had misunderstood the woman sitting beside him. Thomas remained perfectly still. The folder rested open across his lap. His eyes moved from one document to another, but he was no longer simply reading paperwork. He was reliving the past several months through an entirely different lens. The late-night phone calls, the hidden folders, the overtime, the unexplained withdrawals, the evenings Tiffany looked too exhausted to finish dinner. Every memory he had interpreted as distance now carried an explanation he had never allowed himself to consider. He reached for another receipt, then another. Every page carried Tiffany's careful handwriting, dates, reference numbers, payment confirmations, appointment reminders. There wasn't a single careless note among them. Everything had been organized with the same determination she brought to every challenge in her life. Thomas quietly shook his head. You did all of this. His voice barely carried beyond the bench. By yourself. Tiffany looked down at her hands. I never wanted to. He turned another page. One receipt showed a payment made nearly 3 months earlier. The amount immediately caught his attention. I remember this. Tiffany looked up. You do? I asked you why money had come out of our savings. He swallowed hard. You told me you'd explain later. I wasn't trying to lie. I know. He closed his eyes for a moment. I just didn't know what you were protecting, she answered honestly. I wasn't protecting a secret. I was protecting a promise. Thomas slowly folded the receipt and placed it back into the folder. His breathing had become heavier. He reached for one of the overtime pay statements. You worked 6 extra weekends. Tiffany nodded. There weren't many choices. You could have told me. I wanted to. Then why didn't you? She looked toward the ICU hallway before answering. Every time I came close, I pictured your mom sitting at her kitchen table. Thomas remained silent. She kept apologizing. She felt ashamed. She believed she'd failed both of us. I couldn't betray the confidence she placed in me. Thomas rested his elbows on his knees. I wish she had trusted me enough to tell me. So do I. But she wasn't afraid of disappointing herself. Tiffany spoke softly. She was afraid of disappointing you. Those words settled deep inside him. His mother had spent her entire life trying to protect him. Even now, when she needed help the most, her first instinct had been to spare him another burden. He looked down at Paige's handwritten note once again. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. I kept thinking. He stopped. His voice refused to cooperate for a moment. I kept thinking you didn't need me anymore. Tiffany turned toward him. Thomas, I thought every late night meant you were choosing something else over us. I thought every private phone call was another reminder that I'd somehow been pushed out of your life. He gave a quiet, painful laugh. I even convinced myself that paperwork mattered more to you than our marriage. His eyes filled with tears. The whole time, he looked directly at her. You were trying to save my mother. Tiffany reached across the bench and gently placed her hand over his. I wasn't trying to save her alone. I was trying to make sure she had every chance possible. Thomas lowered his head. I'm so sorry. The words came without hesitation. No excuses, no conditions, no attempt to defend himself, only remorse. I should have trusted the woman I've known all these years. Tiffany squeezed his hand gently. You did trust me. No. He slowly shook his head. I trusted my fears more. A quiet silence settled between them. For the first time in months, it no longer felt uncomfortable. It simply allowed two wounded people to finally hear each other. After several moments, Thomas spoke again. I owe you another apology. She waited patiently. I made every conversation about what I wasn't being told. He looked at the stack of documents. I never once stopped to ask what it was costing you to carry all of this by yourself. Tiffany smiled sadly. It was never easy. I can see that now. There were nights I sat at the dining table until after midnight. I remember waking up and finding you gone. I thought you were avoiding me. I was trying to finish paperwork before another deadline. She laughed softly through her tears. Sometimes I'd look at the clock and realize I'd been staring at the same page for 20 minutes because I was too tired to read. Thomas listened without interrupting. I stopped buying little things I wanted. I skipped dinners with friends. I worked extra shifts. I told everyone I was just busy. She looked down at the folder once more. The hardest part wasn't the paperwork. What was? She answered without thinking. Coming home every evening knowing I couldn't tell my husband why I looked so exhausted. Thomas slowly covered his face with one hand. I accused you of shutting me out. You weren't completely wrong. I was. You felt shut out. She looked at him kindly. And your feelings were real. I created that silence. I just never realized how much damage it was causing. Thomas lowered his hand. I wish we'd had this conversation months ago. So do I. He glanced toward the ICU corridor. It might have saved us both a lot of pain. Tiffany nodded. Probably. Another thoughtful silence followed. This one carried reflection instead of misunderstanding. Finally, Thomas looked at her again. Can I ask you something? Of course. When you were sitting outside the operating room today, she knew exactly what he was referring to. And I saw you leave with that folder. I thought you cared more about financial paperwork than about what was happening to Mom. Tiffany smiled gently. I wasn't choosing paperwork over your mom. She paused. I was making sure that when she woke up, the last thing she'd have to worry about was another bill. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life. He reached into his messenger bag and slowly removed the copy of the divorce papers he had kept. He stared at the envelope for several seconds before placing it quietly on the bench between them. I wrote these because I believed our marriage had already disappeared. He looked back at Tiffany. Now I realize something. She waited. Our marriage wasn't falling apart because love disappeared. He swallowed hard. It was falling apart because silence kept speaking louder than either one of us. Tiffany's eyes filled once more. I was so afraid of adding one more burden to your shoulders. You should have let me decide which burdens belong to me. She nodded. You're right. I thought carrying everything alone was protecting our family. Thomas gently squeezed her hand. And I thought assuming the worst was protecting my heart. He gave a weary smile. We were both trying to protect something. Yes, we just ended up hurting each other instead. For the first time since Paige collapsed, neither of them felt trapped behind unspoken words. The truth hadn't erased the pain. It hadn't undone months of misunderstanding, but it had finally given both of them something they hadn't shared in a very long time. The chance to face the same problem together, instead of standing alone on opposite sides of it. For several moments, neither Thomas nor Tiffany spoke. They remained seated on the wooden bench outside the chapel, surrounded by a silence that no longer felt like a wall between them. It had become a place where both of them could finally breathe. Thomas looked down at the envelope resting beside him. Only an hour earlier, he had believed it represented the only future left for their marriage. Now it felt completely out of place. He slowly picked it up. His fingers lingered on the edge of the flap before he carefully removed the documents once again. The pages were neatly organized, just as they had been when he printed them days earlier. He remembered sitting alone in his truck after another argument, convincing himself that every unanswered question had already become an answer. He remembered reading through the legal paperwork late at night, while Tiffany sat downstairs completing financial assistance applications he knew nothing about. He remembered telling himself that love couldn't survive without honesty. Looking back now, he realized honesty had never disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath fear, misplaced responsibility, and two people trying to protect one another without speaking openly. Thomas quietly smiled to himself, not because he felt happy, because he finally understood how easily good intentions could become painful misunderstandings. He folded the papers once, then again. Without another word, he slowly tore them down the middle. The sound of paper separating echoed softly through the quiet hallway. Tiffany looked toward him, but said nothing. He tore the pages again and again, until the documents that had almost ended their marriage had become nothing more than small pieces resting in his hands. Thomas looked at them for a long moment before dropping them into a nearby recycling bin. When he returned to the bench, he let out a slow breath. I should have done that before I ever walked into this hospital. Tiffany's eyes glistened. You were hurting. So were you. He sat beside her again. I just couldn't see it. For the first time in months, Tiffany reached for his hand without hesitation. Thomas immediately intertwined his fingers with hers. The simple gesture felt strangely unfamiliar, not because they had stopped loving each other, because they had spent so many weeks carrying separate burdens that they had almost forgotten what it felt like to carry one together. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly. "I know I've already said it, but I need you to hear it again. I judged you without asking enough questions. I let my fears write a story that wasn't true. I stopped believing in the woman who has stood beside me through every difficult season of my life." Tiffany gently rubbed the back of his hand with her thumb. "And I'm sorry I believed protecting everyone meant shutting you out." She looked directly into his eyes. "You've always been my partner. I should have trusted you with the truth." Thomas nodded slowly. "I would have been scared. I know. I probably would have worried every day. I know. I would have wanted to help. I know." He smiled sadly. "And maybe together we would have found a better way." Tiffany returned the smile. "I think we would have." A nurse approached from the ICU corridor. She recognized them immediately. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's all right," Tiffany replied. The nurse smiled warmly. "Paige has started responding to simple verbal cues." Thomas immediately stood. "Is she awake?" "Only briefly. She's still very sleepy, but she opened her eyes for a few moments." "You're welcome to come in." Thomas looked toward Tiffany. They entered the ICU together. Nothing about the room had changed, except one small detail. Paige's eyes were open. They weren't fully focused yet. The medication still left her exhausted, but when she noticed two familiar figures walking toward her bedside, the corners of her mouth lifted into the faintest smile. Thomas gently leaned over the bed. "Hey, Mom." Her eyes slowly found his, then shifted toward Tiffany. She looked from one to the other. Perhaps she noticed the difference immediately. Perhaps it was simply a mother's instinct. Either way, she seemed to understand something had changed. Thomas carefully squeezed her hand. "The surgery went well." Paige blinked once. Another slow smile appeared. Tiffany stepped closer. "You're doing exactly what the doctors hoped." Paige's lips moved slightly. The words were barely audible. "You both." Thomas leaned closer. "What was that?" She gathered enough strength to whisper again. "Together." Tears immediately filled Tiffany's eyes. "We're together." Thomas answered before Tiffany could. "And we're staying that way." Paige closed her eyes for a moment, as though those words alone allowed her to rest a little easier. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. Outside the room, nurses moved quietly between patients. Inside, the atmosphere felt different. Not because every problem had disappeared. There were still days of recovery ahead. Follow-up appointments, physical therapy, a long healing process. Life would not suddenly become easy, but something far more important had changed. The people facing those challenges were finally standing on the same side again. Thomas looked toward Tiffany. "No more carrying impossible things by yourself." She nodded. "No more. No more deciding what I can handle without asking me. I promise. And no more pretending everything's fine when it isn't." She smiled through fresh tears. "I promise that too." He gently wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We'll figure things out together. Every single time." Tiffany rested her head lightly against him. "For better or worse." Thomas smiled. "We probably should have remembered those words a little sooner." She laughed softly. "So should I." The quiet laugh surprised both of them. After everything they had endured, hearing even a small moment of warmth return felt almost like healing itself. Paige slowly opened her eyes again. She looked at Thomas, then Tiffany. Finally, she managed one more tired smile before drifting back to sleep. Thomas lowered his voice. "I think she heard us." "I think she did too." He looked at Tiffany one last time before they quietly left the room together, careful not to disturb Paige's rest. As they walked side by side through the hospital corridor, neither of them hurried. There was nowhere else they needed to be. Months earlier, they had started walking separate emotional paths without realizing it. Tonight, for the first time in a very long while, they were walking the same road again. Neither believed the healing process would happen overnight. Trust would continue rebuilding through honest conversations. Life would still bring unexpected hardships. There would still be difficult decisions waiting beyond the hospital walls. But they had learned something neither of them would ever forget. Love doesn't grow stronger because two people avoid painful conversations. It grows stronger when they choose to face those conversations together, even when the truth feels heavy. And as they disappeared down the hallway side by side, hope quietly began taking the place that resentment had occupied for far too long. The first morning after Paige's surgery brought something the family hadn't experienced in days. Hope. It didn't arrive in dramatic fashion. There were no grand announcements. No doctor declaring that every danger had passed. Hope appeared in quieter ways. Paige's blood pressure remained stable throughout the night. Her breathing improved enough that one piece of equipment was no longer necessary. The surgical team expressed cautious optimism during morning rounds. Recovery had officially begun. Thomas and Tiffany stood together outside Paige's room as the vascular surgeon reviewed the next steps. The surgery went well, the doctor explained. Now our focus shifts to healing. He pointed toward the chart in his hands. The first few days are important. We'll monitor circulation, kidney function, pain control, and make sure there aren't any unexpected complications. Thomas nodded carefully. And after that? If everything continues moving in the right direction, we'll gradually help her sit up, stand, and eventually walk short distances. The doctor smiled reassuringly. Recovery after this type of surgery takes patience. We understand, Tiffany replied. We're prepared for that. The doctor looked between them. Good. She's going to need both of you. After the physician left, Thomas turned toward Tiffany. He's right. She smiled gently. Then we'll both be here. For the next several days, the hospital became part of their daily routine. Every morning, Thomas stopped by Paige's room before heading to check on his employees. He refused to accept new installation jobs himself, choosing instead to handle scheduling and paperwork from the office whenever possible. His foreman offered to manage field operations for a while. Family comes first, he insisted. Thomas didn't argue. Each afternoon he returned to the hospital, carrying fresh clothes for Paige, books from home, or simply another cup of coffee for Tiffany. She never had to ask. He noticed the little things now. If she forgot to eat, he quietly brought her a sandwich. If she looked tired, he reminded her to step outside for fresh air. If another stack of paperwork appeared, he sat beside her, instead of assuming she wanted privacy. One afternoon he smiled as he pulled another chair next to hers. So? She looked up from the discharge planning booklet. So? I think it's my turn. My turn for what? Helping with paperwork. Tiffany laughed softly. You sure? I own a business. He smiled. I can handle forms. She slid the folder toward him. Then start with this page. He read the first paragraph carefully. Well, he looked back at her. I officially apologize to every person who's ever had to explain hospital paperwork to me. She laughed harder than she had in weeks. Several nurses glanced toward them before smiling themselves. The sound reminded Tiffany how long it had been since laughter came naturally. As Paige grew stronger, small victories replaced frightening uncertainties. The first time she sat on the edge of the hospital bed without assistance, she smiled proudly, despite obvious discomfort. I feel like I climbed a mountain. Thomas gently adjusted her pillow. You look like someone who just won. She smiled. I'll take that. The following day, a physical therapist arrived to begin the next stage of recovery. We're not training for a marathon, the therapist explained warmly. We're simply teaching your body to trust itself again. Paige nodded. I think my body and I have some catching up to do. With careful guidance, she slowly stood using a walker. Thomas instinctively stepped forward. The therapist smiled. Stay close, but let her do as much as she safely can. Thomas immediately nodded. Paige took one careful step, then another. Each movement required effort. Her breathing became heavier. Halfway across the room, she stopped. I need a break. That's perfectly normal, the therapist assured her. You're doing well. Thomas couldn't hide his smile. You know, he said quietly, I've never been this proud of someone taking 6 steps. Paige laughed. They're excellent steps. They really are. Every day added another small achievement. One hallway instead of half a room. A little less pain. A little more confidence. Recovery never happened all at once. It happened through dozens of moments that looked almost ordinary until someone remembered where the journey had begun. One afternoon, Tiffany arrived at the hospital carrying only a small shoulder bag. Thomas noticed immediately. No folders today? She smiled. No folders. No paperwork? Everything's finished. He looked at her for a second before gently taking the bag from her shoulder. Good. She frowned playfully. What are you doing? I'm giving you the afternoon off. She laughed. I don't think hospitals work that way. I already asked the nurse. You did? She told me Paige has therapy in an hour. So? So I'm staying. And you're leaving. Tiffany blinked. You've barely slept in months. You've lived on coffee. You've worked overtime. You've carried everyone. He gently squeezed her hand. You promised we'd face things together now. I did. Then let me keep my promise too. For a moment, Tiffany looked as though she might argue. Instead, she quietly nodded. What am I supposed to do? Thomas smiled. Go home. Take a shower that isn't rushed. Eat something that doesn't come from a vending machine. Maybe sleep for a few hours. And don't feel guilty about it. She looked toward Paige's room. I haven't left for very long since surgery. I know, but Mom's not alone. He smiled warmly. She has me. Tiffany looked at him with quiet gratitude. Thank you. No. He gently kissed her forehead. Thank you. For the first time since Paige's collapse, Tiffany drove home without mentally reviewing appointments, insurance notes, or payment deadlines. The house felt unusually peaceful. She stood in the living room for a long moment, simply taking in the silence. The dining room table, once buried beneath paperwork, now sat completely clear. She slowly ran her hand across its smooth surface. It reminded her how much life had changed in such a short time. After a warm shower, she settled onto the couch, intending only to close her eyes for a few minutes. She didn't wake until sunlight had begun fading through the windows. It was the deepest sleep she had experienced in months. Back at the hospital, Thomas remained beside Paige through her afternoon therapy session. When she grew discouraged after struggling with a few exercises, he never rushed her. You don't have to finish the whole hallway today, she sighed. I used to walk all over my garden without thinking. And you will again. How can you be so sure? He smiled. Because I've watched you teach children to love books. I've watched you rebuild flower beds after storms. I've watched you raise me. He gently adjusted the walker. You've never been someone who quits halfway through anything. Paige smiled proudly. I suppose that's true. I know it is. That evening, Tiffany returned to the hospital looking noticeably different. Not because anything about her appearance had changed dramatically, because she looked rested. The tension that had lived across her face for months had softened. Thomas noticed immediately. Better? She nodded. So much better. Paige smiled from her chair near the window. I think both of you finally listened. Thomas laughed. We're trying. Keep trying. Paige looked warmly at both of them. It's a good look on you. As the three of them shared dinner from the hospital cafeteria, the conversation drifted naturally, from doctors and medications to favorite family recipes, funny childhood memories, and plans for spring once Paige returned home. For the first time in many months, no one avoided difficult subjects. No one carried hidden burdens. No one felt alone inside the same room. The challenges ahead hadn't disappeared. Recovery would continue for weeks. Trust would continue rebuilding one conversation at a time. But something much stronger had taken root inside that hospital room. The family no longer faced the future as three individuals carrying separate worries. They had become exactly what Tiffany had hoped to protect from the very beginning, a family moving forward together. Paige remained at Tampa General for several more days before her medical team determined she was ready for the next stage of recovery. A rehabilitation unit would help her rebuild strength before she returned home. When the discharge coordinator explained the plan, Thomas instinctively looked toward Tiffany. She smiled. "You don't have to look at me first anymore." He laughed quietly. "I know. I just wanted to make sure we're hearing the same thing." "We are." The coordinator noticed the exchange and smiled. "I like seeing families make decisions together." Thomas glanced at Tiffany. "So do I." That simple moment reminded both of them how much had changed. Not because life had become easier, because they had stopped trying to solve difficult problems alone. Before Paige left the surgical floor, Thomas and Tiffany sat together with a hospital financial representative to review the final paperwork connected to her care. Months earlier, Tiffany would have attended the meeting by herself. This time, Thomas pulled his chair beside hers. The representative placed several documents on the table. These summarize the financial assistance approval, the insurance adjustments, and the remaining account history. Thomas looked toward Tiffany. "You explain this one." She smiled. "Only if you promise to ask questions." "I promise." She slowly walked him through every page. "This section shows the original charges." She pointed to another column. "These are the adjustments after the assistant's approval." Another page followed. "This confirms the payment we completed before surgery." Thomas listened carefully. For the first time, hospital billing statements no longer felt confusing or intimidating. They simply told the story Tiffany had been trying to manage for months. When the meeting ended, Thomas thanked the representative. Then he turned toward Tiffany. "I don't ever want you carrying something like this by yourself again." "I won't." "You'd better not." She smiled. "I'm holding you to that." As they walked back toward Paige's room, Thomas reached for her hand without thinking. She smiled as their fingers intertwined. It had become natural again. Not because trust had magically returned overnight, because both of them had chosen to practice it through small, everyday actions. The following Saturday, Thomas suggested something they hadn't done in months. After visiting Paige, he stopped outside a small cafe a few blocks from the hospital. "We've got an hour before visiting time starts again." Tiffany looked at the sign. "You want coffee?" "I want to sit with my wife." The words made her smile immediately. Inside, the cafe buzzed with quiet conversations and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. They found a small table near the window. For several minutes, they talked about everything except hospitals. Thomas shared stories from work. One of his technicians had accidentally startled himself when an old ventilation fan suddenly started after a power test. Tiffany laughed so hard, she nearly spilled her coffee. "I wish I'd seen that." So did everyone else. The easy conversation reminded them of the couple they had been before fear and silence found their way into the middle of their marriage. Eventually, Thomas grew thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something." "What is it?" "When all of this is over," he paused, "I don't want us to go back to the way things were." She tilted her head slightly. "You mean before your mom got sick?" "No." He shook his head gently. "I mean before we started assuming the other person was fine." Tiffany nodded slowly. "I've thought about that too. I think we need some new habits." "Like what?" Thomas smiled. No hiding worries, even if they're small. She nodded. No pretending everything's okay just because we don't want to burden each other. Exactly. And once a week. He smiled. We sit down together and look at every financial decision. Tiffany laughed. A budget date? That's what we're calling it. She shook her head, still smiling. Only you could make spreadsheets sound romantic. They're not. He laughed too. But honesty is. When they returned to the hospital later that afternoon, Paige noticed something immediately. You two are smiling again? Thomas looked toward Tiffany. We had coffee. Paige raised an eyebrow. Just coffee? And a conversation. Those are usually even more important. Tiffany pulled a chair beside Paige's bed. You know? Paige looked at her. I owe you an apology. Paige frowned. For what? I should have encouraged you to tell Thomas much sooner. The older woman slowly shook her head. No, I asked you to keep my confidence. I placed you in an impossible position. You didn't know where all of this would lead. I still hate that my mistake became your burden. Tiffany gently reached for Paige's hand. It became our burden. Thomas stepped closer. And now it stays that way. Paige looked from one to the other. Her eyes became glossy. I spent so much time trying to protect both of you. Thomas smiled warmly. I know. I've always wanted you to have an easier life than I did. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. You already gave me that. You raised me. You taught me what family looks like. And now it's my turn to help carry you. Paige closed her eyes briefly. I don't deserve the two of you. Tiffany immediately answered. Families don't earn love. They give it. The rehabilitation staff continued working with Paige each day. She gradually replaced the walker with a cane for short distances. Each new accomplishment felt less like a medical milestone and more like another piece of ordinary life returning. One afternoon, she proudly walked the length of the rehabilitation hallway without stopping. Thomas clapped softly. I think somebody's showing off. Paige laughed. I've earned the right. You definitely have. Nearby, Tiffany quietly recorded the moment on her phone. Not for social media, not to send to anyone. Simply because she wanted to remember the day hope became visible. Weeks passed. Hospital visits became shorter. Doctors spoke more about home exercises than surgical concerns. Future plans slowly replaced emergency decisions. One evening, as Thomas and Tiffany drove home after another rehabilitation visit, he reached across the center console and gently took her hand. I've been thinking. She smiled. Should I be worried? Probably not. She laughed. Go ahead. When your mom taught you to help people? She looked puzzled. My mom? You've always said she taught you that caring for people isn't just about fixing problems. She nodded. That's true. I think my mom taught me something too. What was that? He looked ahead at the road. Love isn't measured by how many burdens you carry. He squeezed her hand gently. It's measured by how willing you are to carry them together. Tiffany looked out the window for a moment before quietly answering. I think both our mothers would be proud of that. By the time they reached home, neither of them pretended the difficult months had never happened. They couldn't erase the misunderstandings. They couldn't erase the pain. But they had done something even more valuable. They had learned how to build a stronger marriage on the other side of it. Not by avoiding hardship, but by refusing to face it alone. And with every shared decision, every honest conversation, and every ordinary moment they reclaimed together, it became clear that the foundation beneath their family was no longer cracked by silence. It had been rebuilt through trust. 3 weeks after her surgery, Paige stood near the front entrance of the rehabilitation center, with a small overnight bag resting beside her chair. The winter sun warmed the sidewalk outside, and a gentle breeze carried the familiar scent of freshly cut grass through the parking lot. A nurse walked over with a clipboard. I've got one last signature. Paige laughed. I thought I finally escaped paperwork. The nurse smiled. Just one more. Thomas leaned against the reception desk, while Tiffany reviewed the discharge instructions with another member of the medical team. This time, however, there was a noticeable difference. Tiffany wasn't carrying the responsibility alone. Every instruction the nurse explained, Thomas listened to just as carefully. Medication schedule, follow-up appointments, walking goals, dietary recommendations, emergency warning signs. When the nurse finished, Thomas asked a few thoughtful questions of his own. Tiffany smiled quietly. Months earlier, she would have walked out carrying every answer by herself. Today, they left carrying the responsibility together. As they stepped outside, Thomas opened the passenger door of his truck. You've got the best seat. Paige looked at him. I think you're treating me like royalty. He grinned. You survived major surgery. I think you've earned it. She laughed as he carefully helped her into the truck. I suppose I won't argue with that. The drive home felt completely different from the ambulance ride that had brought Paige to the hospital weeks earlier. There were no flashing lights, no urgent phone calls, no fear filling the silence. Instead, sunlight reflected across Tampa's familiar streets while ordinary life unfolded around them. Children waited at school bus stops. Neighbors washed their cars. Cyclists passed along nearby sidewalks. For the first time in a long while, ordinary life felt extraordinary. As they turned into Paige's neighborhood, she looked out the window and smiled. My flowers. The winter had slowed their growth. Several colorful blooms still welcomed her home. I've missed them. Tiffany smiled. They've been waiting for you. Thomas parked in the driveway before helping Paige carefully out of the truck. She paused for a moment, looking at her little house. The bird feeder still hung near the front porch, exactly where she had left it. The rocking chair remained beside the front door. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow everything felt new. Inside, the dining room table stood neatly prepared. A simple meal waited for them. Nothing elaborate, just homemade soup, warm bread, fresh fruit, and iced tea. The same kind of meal they had shared countless times before life became complicated. Thomas looked around the room. It feels good to be here. Paige nodded. It feels like home. As they settled into their usual places around the table, a comfortable silence lingered for a few moments. Not the painful silence that had once separated them. The peaceful kind that only exists when people no longer feel the need to hide what is in their hearts. Paige looked at both of them. I've had a lot of time to think. Thomas smiled. I figured you might. She looked toward the window before speaking. When I was lying in that hospital bed, I kept asking myself one question. What question? Tiffany asked. What kind of family do I want to leave behind? Neither Thomas nor Tiffany interrupted. I realized something. She folded her hands gently on the table. I spent my whole life trying to protect the people I love. Her eyes settled on Thomas. I wanted to spare you from worry. Then she looked at Tiffany. And I asked you to carry a burden that never should have belonged to you alone. Tiffany quietly reached across the table and squeezed Paige's hand. You were frightened. I was, Paige nodded. But fear has a way of convincing us that carrying everything alone is an act of love. She smiled softly. Sometimes it isn't. Thomas lowered his eyes for a moment. I've been thinking about my part, too. Both women looked toward him. I spent months believing I already knew the answers. He leaned back in his chair. I stopped asking questions because I convinced myself I'd already figured everything out. He smiled sadly. The truth was standing right in front of me. I just wasn't seeing it. Tiffany looked at him with quiet affection. I wasn't making it easy. You were trying to keep a promise? I was. But I should have trusted that we were strong enough to carry it together. Thomas nodded. And I should have trusted the woman I'd spent years building a life with. A gentle smile spread across Paige's face. "You know what makes me happiest?" "What?" Thomas asked. "You've both stopped trying to be the strongest person in the room." She looked at each of them. "Now you're simply trying to stand beside each other." No one spoke for several seconds. The quiet carried gratitude instead of uncertainty. After lunch, they moved onto the back porch. The afternoon sun warmed the wooden deck, while birds fluttered around the feeder Paige loved so much. Thomas brought out 3 glasses of sweet tea. Tiffany tucked a blanket around Paige's legs. They watched the neighborhood settle into another peaceful afternoon. Children laughed somewhere down the street. A lawn mower hummed in the distance. Wind gently stirred the leaves overhead. Ordinary sounds, ordinary moments, the kind that often go unnoticed until life reminds people how precious they truly are. Thomas finally broke the silence. "You know," he smiled toward Tiffany, "I almost threw away the best thing that's ever happened to me." She looked at him. "And I almost lost it because I believed silence was protecting it." Paige chuckled softly. "I think all 3 of us learned something." "I know I did," Thomas admitted. Tiffany nodded. "So did I." The older woman looked toward the small flower garden she loved so much. "Gardens teach patience," she smiled. "You don't see growth every day, but if you keep caring for them." She glanced back toward Thomas and Tiffany. "One morning you realize everything has started blooming again." Neither of them answered. They didn't need to. The truth was already sitting around that table. Not in speeches, not in dramatic promises, but in the quiet changes they had made. Thomas asked more questions before making assumptions. Tiffany shared burdens instead of carrying them alone. Paige accepted help instead of believing she had to protect everyone from her own struggles. Their family hadn't become perfect. No family ever does. They had simply learned that honesty and compassion belong in the same conversation. As the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, Thomas looked across at Tiffany and smiled. "I'm really glad you came into my life." She smiled back. "I'm glad I stayed." He reached for her hand. This time there was no hesitation from either of them. Sometimes the greatest acts of love happen quietly, without applause or recognition. Sometimes the deepest wounds inside a family aren't caused by the absence of love, but by the absence of honest communication. And sometimes healing begins the very moment people stop assuming they already know each other's hearts and choose, instead, to truly listen. If you had been in Thomas's place, would you have reacted differently before learning the truth? Or if you were Tiffany, would you have kept the same promise, knowing what it might cost? Share your thoughts in the comments. We genuinely love to hear your perspective. And if this story reminded you that kindness, honesty, and understanding can change lives, thank you for spending your time with us here at Hollow Creek Chronicles. Subscribe for more heartfelt stories that explore the choices, relationships, and quiet moments that shape who we become. Until next time, take care of the people you love, and don't leave the important conversations for tomorrow.